today we're talking about this topic. So what even is complexity and why does it matter? Before we start, I'm in Australia, in Melbourne, so I just want to offer an acknowledgement of country. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and the world, and to recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters within and around it. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the deep wisdom that First Nations people hold in respect of the ideas that specifically we're going to be exploring today, because systems and complexity really sit at the core of Indigenous people's values, knowledge systems and way of life. To quote from a paper by some Indigenous authors, Amberlin and Blaise Quaimulina, in Aboriginal philosophy, the universe is a pattern comprised of other patterns, of systems inside systems. Nothing exists in isolation. All life exists in relationship to everything else. So I just feel like that acknowledgement, which I always do before all of my presentations, carries an even more of a significance in the context of today's conversation and discussion that we'll be having. So we've got about an hour and a half together. It's going to be a combination of me talking and some solo sort of reflective time and some group work as well. So before I sort of kick into the content, and we'll see sort of how many people drop in and how we arrange things depending on how many people are here, but I thought I'd just offer a quick video which tells you a bit more about CPI, the Centre for Public Impact, which is where I work, and why this conversation around complexity and systems thinking is so central to what we do.
Over the past decade, the relationship between people and government has become increasingly frayed. A series of global shocks have shaken citizens' trust in their government's ability to adapt to meet their changing needs, and the power to drive change continues to rest in the hands of relatively few. In 2020, the COVID-19 crisis has brought into sharp focus the need for government to work differently. Until now, much of the debate around government and public service reform is about what government should do, how services should be structured, how performance should be tracked, or how decisions should be made. However, the damaged relationship between government and citizens is proof that not enough emphasis has been placed to date on how government should be, the beliefs and principles that drive government action. But there is hope. Changemakers at different levels of government and in frontline public services around the world are pioneering a new vision for government based on three core beliefs. First, that most of the challenges we face as a society are complex in nature. Second, that the quality of human relationships matters a great deal. And third, that progress is best achieved through experimentation and a process of continuous learning. These beliefs have given rise to a new set of values and principles that serve as a useful guide for the future of government, particularly as leaders are grappling with how to rebuild a post-COVID society. They call on government leaders to think systemically and act locally, share power with those best placed to act, challenge unnecessary hierarchy and collaborate across boundaries, seek out strengths and build on them, champion the voices of those who are heard the least, and optimise for learning rather than control. While the disconnect between government and people has been growing for some time, the COVID-19 recovery presents a powerful opportunity for us to close that gap and reimagine government so that it works for everyone. Are you part of the growing movement to reimagine government? Join the conversation.
So given that we are quite a small group, I've sort of, Abram gave me a lovely introduction, and I've just sort of offered you in that video a sense of where my thinking's at and the organisation that I'm affiliated with. Given that we're such a small group, I wonder if it's worthwhile, if everyone's happy, if we just sort of go round and just try keep it relatively brief, but it'd be lovely to just hear from you where you are in the world, what your name is, and why you're here. It may be because of the work that you do, it may be because of something else, but just a brief introduction from all of you. So does anyone want to volunteer to start?
Sure, I'll get us going.
Thanks,
Sure. Thanks for being here, Thea. So I'm Kyle Godby. I'm actually in the United States. I'm in Richmond, Virginia. I work for a major U.S. bank called Capital One as a service designer. I was actually introduced to complex adaptive theory, complex adaptive systems and complexity theory in Cynefin through Abram, and I'm continuing to study that and apply that to building internal platforms and systems at work. And I'm fascinated by the sort of stuff that we've been doing here.
Fantastic, thank you. I might pass around. I'm struggling to see people's names actually. Hang on, let me just bring up. Okay, thanks, Abram.
No worries. Sasha, do you want to go?
Sure. Good evening, I'm Sutton, and given that I'm saying it's evening, I'm located in the Pacific time zone on the west coast of the U.S. And I've been fascinated by the design thinking and design process as a science for almost a decade. And this pandemic has given me this wonderful opportunity to be part of it. I've tried being regular over here for a while, and finally I've put it down in stone that I'm going to be here because I've made a monetary commitment that forces me to basically be here and make sure I take care of my other business and commercial needs and make sure I'm here. So I'm here to learn and share thoughts and get different perspectives that come to this table here in this forum.
Great, thank you. Grace.
Hi, my name is Grace Meyer. I've been a designer my whole life. I've always loved art and engineering and ways I can mix these together with how I view the world. I studied communication and industrial design at Carnegie Mellon, and then and they have a really good, just through undergrad, good design systems thinking part of their curriculum. And I went into, I pursued the industrial design after school. I worked in sports technology and wearable technology and kind of found my niche in designing like ergonomics for headphones, for sports headphones. And that ended up taking me, my small company was, I was working for, was bought, they sent me to China. So I was working on the manufacturing side. So seeing how that system worked in China. Just, you know, how everything's made of all these systems coming in and out, how corporations work. And now I'm, you know, I really appreciated Thea's introduction about talking about acknowledging the elders, because I think, you know, I'm going more that path. How do I support communities with these skills versus just stuff? So I'm working for a Taoist priest who's working with several large nonprofits, and some of these are kind of around community forming and how to share knowledge for community benefit. So looking at business models for rethinking social media and web platforms. And I just moved to LA. That's where I am. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Grace, and welcome again. Dan.
Hello, hello. I'm in Victoria, BC, Canada. I'm shifting from social work into user experience and service design. It's a great place to come from. I am able to use a lot of my passion for community and specifically working with Indigenous communities in Canada to take some of that knowledge and passion and use the design thinking processes immediately to to improve my scale and ability to problem solve and work on issues. So I'm here to learn, and yeah, I'm excited.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. All right. We've got three more. David.
I think you can hear me. Hello, guys. Yeah, just on public transport at the moment, and this has come across into my point of view. I'm a friend of mine who works for a council in Melbourne. So I'm based in Australia, but in New South Wales, and I run a business around food waste into food, converting food waste onto food through urban farms through our local community. I'm here because I think I'd love to develop and work out how we can get a little bit of scale, I guess, but working with local councils and how we can tailor what we do to that a little bit differently. We've tried so many different approaches to make this happen effectively, so it's just trying to see what ideas can come out of this. Really appreciative. It's some really good motivation. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. It's good to have you, David. Cool. Bushan.
Hey, thanks, Thea, for coming, and I'm very eagerly looking forward to your topic. I'm an independent consultant. I'm based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and almost all the time that I work on enterprise apps, the kind of systems that I define are in two ways. One is the platform, which is the technology that is going to drive the enterprise apps. And the other system that I mostly refer to is the senior stakeholders, the company, the team that I'm going to work with, the different kinds of mentalities that people bring across the table. How do you, as a consultant of user-centered design, how do you convince people or business analysts about the efficacy of the problems that you're going to solve, or the solutions that you're going to give, and so on and so forth? So in my field of work, the complexity is really very, very strong, I would say, in terms of dealing with not just people's mentalities, but also in dealing with the kind of complex systems that we have in terms of technology, digital technology, etc. So I'm through these sessions with Abram and through your talk as well, I'm trying to understand how I can navigate through all these challenges in my consulting role. So thanks for being here, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Awesome. And last but not least, Dawn. All right. I think maybe Dawn, we've lost her, but Thea, back to you, and then we'll touch base with Dawn later.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Oh, sorry, Dawn. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, Dawn, go. We've got you back, I think.
No. Okay. Dawn, feel free to drop something in the chat. It looks like you're just on the phone, so conscious that it might be a bit hard for you, but just feel free to drop something into the chat if and when that works. So it sounds like we've got a really nice mix of people, good geographic spread, and I guess varying degrees of familiarity with the concepts that I'm going to be talking about today. So it's always hard to craft a conversation that hits all the right levels. So to those of you who are already familiar with certain things that I talk about, feel free to add, to question, to critique. And for those for whom this is newer material, I'd welcome questions and points of clarification, because it is easy to lose sight of how much jargon can sort of make its way into these kinds of conversations. So please do pull me up if I start to use language that doesn't make sense, or if I'm describing things in ways that just aren't resonating for you. So today we're going to be talking about this question. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. So I've thought about this sort of presentation in two parts. For the first half, we're going to be focusing on what is complexity. And then I'll do some talking to that, and then we'll do some activities. And then the second half, we'll talk about why it matters. Why does it matter to be able to understand what complexity is, to be able to identify it? So we'll start off with what is complexity. So Kyle, you mentioned the Cynefin framework. And I think this is a really nice framework to begin with. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just give you a moment to look at this. I'm not going to talk about it in huge detail because I actually found a video, which I'll play in a minute, just a short video, which I think does a really nice job of talking about this, particularly in the context of leadership. But for those of you who can, because I'm conscious that Dawn's on the phone and David's on a bus or a train or something, but for those of you who can, I'd also invite you just to grab a pen and a piece of paper and draw 4 quadrants onto the piece of paper and just copy the black words onto the quadrants as they appear. So pop in a complicated, a complex, an obvious, and a chaotic. And we'll come back to that in a moment for in a little bit for an activity. But I'll just give you a minute to do that. So the Cynefin framework, as I said, I'm not going to talk to it in great detail because I'll play a video on it in just a moment, but it was developed by David Snowden, who's from Wales, and he runs a firm now called Cognitive Edge. And what this is, he explains it not as a categorization tool, but as a sense-making tool, as a tool to help you stop and pause in your life and make sense of the environment in which you're operating and starting to understand, okay, is this an obvious, does this situation in which I find myself fall within the obvious quadrant? Is it a complicated setting? Is it complex, or is it chaotic? And as we'll come to sort of later in the session, it's really important to be able to distinguish between what kind of environment you're operating in, because that shapes the kind of approach and mindsets and tools and practices that you need. So I'll move on to the next slide and just play this short video. It runs for about 4 minutes, which explains a little bit about how this framework is useful in a leadership context.
So over time, leaders develop patterns and habits in the way we approach things. And often those patterns and habits have worked really well for us in the past. And the problem with them is that we get so used to them that we can forget what the situation calls for and just rely on our own habits. And that's why Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework is really helpful, both for us to use to think about ourselves and to use to think about how do we address things with teams. Snowden's framework makes the big distinction between those things which are predictable and those things which are unpredictable. In the predictable world, you can expect things to repeat time after time. They just cycle around. In the unpredictable world, though, things are really different. They don't necessarily happen again in the way they've happened before. He further then separates the predictable world into 2 different categories. The things that are obvious are those things that everybody agrees. The connection between cause and effect is so tight, it's so apparent, it's so clear that there's best practice around that stuff. It's well researched. So those are the things like, say, there's a recipe for it almost. Like you bake a cake one time, you know how it's going to come out. You bake it again, it's going to come out the same way if you use the same ingredients and the same recipe. And in the obvious space, you should be able to get things that repeat predictably time after time using best practices and recipes, checklists, things like that. In the complicated space, which is the other domain Snowden talks about in the predictable world, In the complicated space, it's different. There is a connection between cause and effect, but it's kind of fuzzy, and you need experts to figure it out. So things repeat over time, but you need a lot of experience or domain expertise to know which approach to take. This isn't the place where we'd have best practice, because experts might disagree about these things. This is the place we'd have good practice, where solid experts with really good research or experience would say, I think you should go this way. Another expert might say, I think you should go this other way. But in general, they're going in the same direction. Things like really hard things that have lots of moving parts can be in this category. Things like bringing a person to the moon, making a rocket ship go to the moon. That lives in this domain, in fact. So you get engineers and scientists and people in charge of rockets and fuel, and all those folks each work together on their own piece. You put it together and you have a machine that will take you someplace wonderful. When you cross over into the unpredictable domain, actually the rules all change, and how we act as leaders also needs to change. Over here, you can't tell what's going to happen next simply because it's happened before. You need to come up with new approaches, novel approaches, safe to fail experiments to figure out how to nudge the system in a new direction. People say parenting isn't rocket science, but actually rocket science is in the complicated domain. Parenting is in the complex domain. Leading people is in the complex domain. Culture change is in the complex domain. These are things that just because they happen one way once, you can't count on them happening that way again. Then Snowden offers us the chaotic domain. And in chaos, there's no connection between cause and effect. We just can't make out the patterns. There, a leader's job is to stabilize the system and see if over time patterns can emerge. We experiment our way, safe to fail experiments in the complex space, and then eventually some things will become predictable and repeatable over time. You can move them across the Cynefin map into the complicated space, and then maybe even some of those things become obvious over time. And in that way, as leaders use the whole of the Cynefin map, they can fit their style and their problem-solving approach to the actual conditions at hand, instead of relying on our habits, which might take us really well in one area and not so well in another area.
So I think that video does a pretty good job of explaining the Kinetic Framework. There are a couple of things that I disagree with. The first thing I disagree with is her assertion that cause and effect is fuzzy in the complicated space. I don't think that's true. I'll come to that in a minute. I think cause and effect is clear in the complicated space. But what the point is, when you hear Dave Snowden talk about it, but I didn't show a video of him because he's like impenetrable. But when you hear Dave Snowden talk about it, he says that's where you need expertise. So I think a really good example of a complicated problem is like if you were to disassemble a clock, as a layperson, you couldn't work out how to put it back together. But if you had expertise in clockmaking, all the bits fit together. It's not simple, it's complicated, but someone with sufficient expertise can work out how to do it and make the clock work. The other thing that I disagree with is that that assertion that she makes right at the end around sort of moving things from chaotic to complex, from complex to complicated, and sort of nudging things or pushing things across different quadrants. I think sometimes that's possible, but sometimes it's just not possible. And so it's recognizing that certain things will always be complex and certain things will always be complicated. And that's okay. We just need different tools and approaches to manage that. And I'm sorry, I'm just pulling up the chat. So hi, Dawn. Dawn has introduced herself in Charlotte, in C area of the US, working in product support and making the transition to UX design. And Kyle has just put in a fantastic quote from Dave Snowden, which is that an aircraft is complicated and mayonnaise is complex. I love that. So moving on from there, I think that, sorry, I keep clicking the wrong way. I think that a lot of the work that we all do sits in the top two quadrants, so in the complicated and the complex. And I think that often challenges the most important challenges or sort of difficult challenges come up when people treat complex challenges as though they are complicated. Because the way that we are taught to think at school, you know, the logic, the mathematical approach, the reasoning approach, and I studied law, so certainly the kind of training that you get in law works very, very well for complicated problems, but doesn't work very well for complex challenges. And so being able to distinguish between what is a complicated problem and what is the mayonnaise, what is complex, becomes really important. So there's this fantastic article by Sonia, who works with Dave Snowden, where she sets out the 7 differences between complex and complicated. I'm just going to run through 3 of them today, but I've popped in the URL at the top of that slide, and really happy to share slides afterwards. And you can, you know, read more into it yourself. But basically, as was just alluded to, causality is different in complicated and complex environments. So in complicated environments, there is a linear cause and effect pathway that allows us to identify, this is the core, if we do this, this will happen. And that's a very, very dominant mindset. And what we tend to do is move into complex environments like obesity and expect to be able to find the cause, that, you know, the one cause of obesity, or even the 5 causes of obesity. And if we intervene, if we intervene at those points, then we'll change the outcomes. But the reality is that in complex environments or complex challenges like obesity, because of the multiple interacting causes, there are no distinguishable cause and effect pathways. And that's a really, really important point. It doesn't mean we throw our hands up and say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. I'll come to that later. But it does mean that we need to stop applying the mindsets that work for complicated settings to complex ones. So I'm just going to show you the most beautiful video, because I think that, you know, this idea of causality is really well demonstrated by a murmuration of starlings, which people often talk about when they talk about complexity. So I'm just going to show you this for a minute. This is complex. So you can see the way one bird moves and the entire flock moves in sort of unpredictable but beautiful ways. And there is no way that you could study this for as long as you lived and you'd never be able to anticipate the patterns or the movements that cause this to happen. So that's causality. Reducibility is another thing that I think we have really firmly ingrained into us. And that's the idea that we can decompose a system into its structural parts and understand the functional relationships. And that's like the clock piece. Like if we pull this all apart and do a clock-making course, we can understand, and then we'll always be able to put it back together and make the clock work. But in complexity, parts are interrelated and they change in unexpected ways as they interact. So I often use, and I'll come back to this again, a garden as an example of a complex system. You can't pull a garden apart in the way you can pull a clock apart and then put it back together and expect it to work predictably. The soil changes, the weather changes, one crop unexpectedly takes over. You have particularly warm weather, so a bunch of grasshoppers come and kill everything. It's an emergent, complex system, and you can never pull it apart in order to understand it. You need a completely different approach and mindset. And then the final one that I'll talk about is knowability. And, you know, this comes down to the idea that in complicated systems, you know, again, you can, because they're closed systems, they're confined, they can be deconstructed and modeled and known. In contrast, complex systems, it doesn't matter how much data you have, you cannot fully know the system. And the implications of this that Sonia talks about in her blog is that basically the only way to understand a complex system is to interact with it. And a phrase that's often used is dancing with the system, because it's sort of like a tango. You know, you're tangoing with a partner. You have to observe. You have to be completely tuned into what your partner's doing to know what step comes next. Or maybe a salsa is a better analogy because it's not as choreographed. But you know, you can't rely on data alone to help you navigate and know a complex system in the way that you can in a complicated system. So what I'm going to do now is put the timer on and give you about 10 minutes to invite you to draw your own map in that piece of paper that I asked you to pull out before. And you can think about this however you want to. It can be elements of your personal life, it can be elements of your work life, but start thinking about different things that you're working on or experiencing and where they sit in the 4 quadrants. And then we're going to come back and spend about 10 minutes as a group sharing what we found and what we thought about. So I'll invite you to turn your videos off if you want to, and I'll come back in 10 minutes to hear a little bit about any questions that you had or things that came up. So just before we do that, are there any questions or points of clarification that people need before we go into that activity? Great. Okay.
So just a short question. Essentially, it is mapping out all certain things in our life in the 4 quadrants.
Yeah, I think that's right. So you might have been thinking, gosh, you know, I've always thought about that thing that I do as being a complicated thing, but I'm actually realizing that it's a complex thing, or vice versa. I always called it complex, but I've realized that actually it is complicated. So I guess it's starting to think about things in your life that fit across the 4 quadrants. And, you know, and as I said, like some of them may straddle both, some of them may not be entirely clear. That's all fine. It's just an exercise to start thinking about it. I've just popped back up on the screen the difference between complicated and complex, that table, in case that's helpful at all.
I'll take a stab at kind of trying to vocalize how I'm starting to think about this.
Grace, we may just give it another 5 minutes just to let people finish theirs, and then I'll invite. I'd love you to share.
Oh, we're writing it down. Sorry, I missed that.
That's okay, no problems. How are people going? Do you want more time, or do you want to come back now? Maybe just pop in the chat. Or just say thumbs up. Okay. All right, we'll give it a few more minutes and then check in again. Thanks, Dawn. Okay. Apologies about that. Great. All right. So we will start back now with sharing. So just keen for you to, whoever wants to share, just share what came up for you. I've got some questions that I've prepared earlier. Oh, I'm going the wrong way again. So what did you notice as you did this exercise? What surprised you? And what, if anything, did you find challenging? So I'd like to just spend, as much time as we need as a group just talking about that mapping process and what came up for you as part of that.
Well, so I'll go first. I noticed that some of the things that I was doing has a clear sort of a classification, if I may call it. It has a clear classification and then it has a clear justification as to why it is happening. So for example, that's also something that surprised me, by the way. The most obvious thing for me was that I write a journal every day, and that's very obvious. I just have to turn pages. And it's a very simple thing of noting your thoughts and looking as the day progresses about how you performed and so on and so forth. So that's a very obvious part of my life. The complicated part that I found was, and this is something that I did not mention as yet, but it's the entire learning of systems thinking per se that I find very complicated to me, because it's just there are these movable parts, as I call them, and I just can't get them all together in understanding what a system is and how do I tackle all the moving parts. So that came across to me as very complicated. I became a parent, and so my kid is now 2 years old. So that obviously is a complex part for me. Every day is like a new discovery in that journey of raising your kid. So if today goes well, then you pray that tomorrow goes well as well. But there's no guarantee that it will, right? If your kid sleeps at 7 o'clock today, there's no guarantee that he's going to do it again tomorrow. So that's a very complex thing for me to understand. And guess what? Even being a parent, I couldn't figure out that this was a complex thing until I came to this session. The last part, which is the chaotic part, and this shouldn't surprise anyone. For me as an independent consultant, I think the most chaotic part is to understand a client's mindset. What are the expectations of a client? Why is the client expecting something which is way beyond their means or way beyond their skills? Why is a client not doing A versus doing B? Because as a consultant, my first job is to see that you get back on track, given the time frame that we have, given the budgets that we have, given the resources that we have. Sometimes some clients do aim very high. Sometimes they aim very low for no reason. And that is true for every other client. No client is the same. So it's a chaotic situation just to convince them as to why you are doing this the wrong way, or why you're doing this, or why you shouldn't be doing it this way. The chaotic part is the most challenging. The third question, what I found challenging, was the chaotic part. I found that challenging, not just as an exercise during this group session, but also in reality. When I'm going to meet customers, there's always this fear in my mind about how do I read their minds? And I've never been able to capture that. And I've never been able to come around that thought. So that's my answer for these three questions.
Thank you. That's really helpful and interesting insights. I should say that you don't have to be able to put stuff into all of the categories, and you would hope that so like an example of a chaotic environment, for example, is COVID, right? Where it's like it is unprecedented. It's a crisis. And what I've gone back to the Cynefin framework, and what Dave Snowden talks about is that in chaotic environments, you don't have time even to probe the system. You just need to act. So that's just like a lockdown is an example of a response to a chaotic event. And then once you've acted, then you sense and respond. So it may well be, it was interesting to hear your reflections on Bushan, on feeling that understanding the client mindset is chaotic. I would suggest that that's actually more complex than chaotic. And I think that the chaos probably that's affecting all of our lives at the moment is COVID. And there may be other things as well. But you would hope in your life that that chaotic things don't happen all that often. So just wanted to offer that challenge back.
No, I think I should have mentioned this. Thanks for bringing this up, Thea, but I should have mentioned this, that consultants do work on and I take this as a matter of personal experience, that sometimes you are dropped into a situation which you did not expect to be dropped into. So even though you are a subject matter expert, the kind of challenges that you face during that particular period is completely unknown to you. And depending upon what those challenges are, I would certainly call them chaotic, because then there are so many things that because the time frame is very short, and you have to do a lot of things in that short period, not to mention understanding all the various dimensions of a project. And without a team, it feels very chaotic, right? So you don't have anybody.
I guess what I'm trying to do here is distinguish between how we usually use the words chaotic, complicated, and complex, and offer a new framing and a new definition, because I hear what you're saying. The way colloquially we use the term chaotic completely describes what you're doing. But when we're starting to think about what are the features according to the Cynefin framework that define chaotic, complex, complicated, we're trying to actually recategorize things that we may have traditionally called chaotic, and thought, actually, when I think about it according to this framework, it's probably more complex, or maybe even complicated, like, and so really interrogating pre-existing notions about what these mean. But anyway, I do want to make sure that we hear from other people. So does anyone else want to jump in and share some thoughts?
Sure, I'll jump in. So for obvious, I put sort of the routine stuff that I do, the routine stuff that like my wife and I both do, that there's obvious understanding, paying bills, doing chores around the house, that kind of stuff. The stuff that is actually easily messed up as well. In the complicated space, it was interesting to find that my hobbies sort of fall into the complicated space. That's what makes them interesting. I'm a big cocktail nerd, and I'm both a music collector and sort of vaguely a musician. And so there's a lot of divergent paths that you can take by doing that sort of stuff, but there's no right, wrong answer. And then complex is basically all of my human interactions. It's family, it's work, it's parenting, it's just the shifting space. And to kind of, I guess, paraphrase what you were just saying, Thea, there's no constant that I would put in the chaotic bucket, because the constant and chaotic are that's a paradox. And so I didn't put anything there. But if something was to pop up all of a sudden, that would create the chaos.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carl. Did anyone else want to share?
Grace, did you want to share? I know you had some thoughts.
I think I'm going to pass this around, if that's okay.
Cool, no worries.
Dawn or
I can
David?
go.
Yeah, great, Sasha, thanks.
Sure. So for me, just looking at the definition, obvious was, tightly constrained. So doors and driving seem to be pretty obvious based on this definition, chaos, lacking constraint, decoupled, act, sense, respond. That seems more like the play with kids where there's new themes that come up, and one day you're a dragon, one day you're a demon. It's active and it's dynamic, so it kind of has that lacking constraint. And cooking, not on a regular basis, but often for me, I indulge in it in creative based on what is available, and so it kind of lacking constraint, or I would say it's lacking constraint because it's constrained to what's available, handy, and it's not fixed at A, B, C, D, like would be in an obvious or a complicated area. Complex is basically anything that has to do, anything organic, be it living or multiple living beings together, be it work, home. And then complicated is anything with a formula, ABC or X square Y Z. So home repair, traveling, shopping, that seemed to me in a complicated area. Or sometimes I would say shopping can be in the complex area too, depending on whom you're with.
Great, thank you. And did anyone else want to jump in? Dan or David? I'm conscious that you're on the tram, or Dawn.
Yeah, I can jump in. Yeah, in doing chaotic, I'm not sure exactly what fits in, but different art and sort of improvised art or dance really comes to mind, which is interesting because I guess that's often what I'm seeking out. Not everybody, I suppose lots of music or art can be complex or complicated, but a lot of people and myself enjoy the chaotic. So it's interesting to frame it this way. But I've got two kind of projects I'm working on. One is redesigning a website for a fitness instructor, YouTube fitness instructor, and I would put that as complicated. It's like there's other fitness instructors with websites. There's some variables, but it's ultimately kind of a formula. And then complex, I'm also doing some design work with a friend who's creating toys for Indigenous language learning. That gets complex because there's a whole system of Indigenous language, but also how Indigenous language learning works. And there's many different cultural elements and like funding, government funding, and all sorts. So there's a lot of different layers to that. So I would say that's complex.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I guess just to sort of, again, it's like, I think that's a really lovely example of what complexity is, because it's the fact that there are these different interacting parts, and every time they interact, they change the system. And so what works at one moment in time will not work in another moment in time. So it's that very dynamic interplay between the various elements, and the fact that every interaction with the system changes the system itself, that characterize it. So again, a garden is a good example of a complex system because of that. So David, you look like you're off public transport now. Did you want to jump in quickly and share something before we move on to the next activity?
Yeah, absolutely. I've made it to uni at the moment.
Great.
Yeah, this is all completely new to me, so it was actually just grasping and understanding of it, which has been just hearing everyone else's opinions has actually helped, to be honest. So yeah, I was purely just actually kind of understanding it all, to be honest. And I feel like, yeah, with complex, definitely I feel like human interactions is an element of that. I wanted to kind of think about where the weather kind of fitted in as well with all of these as well. But yeah, I'm just open to learning some more about it. I've written some points, but
Right.
I think hearing everyone else's points of view was helpful for sure.
Brilliant. Well, thanks everyone. And just to sort of to offer, just to close this part of the section, just I guess if I were to think about in my work, you know, what's complex, what's complicated, what fits across the quadrants. I think if I think about like things that government does, you know, obvious is some of the, like, you know, similar things to things that you have identified. So the obvious things are like the, you know, budget processes that sit behind the scenes in government, or the briefing processes to brief ministers, stuff like that. Just the, you know, the stuff you barely even think about because you just sort of churn through it and follow formulas. Although you could argue that, and again, this is the interesting thing about this framework, right? Like people could say, well, no, actually briefing ministers is complicated, and that's probably true. So, you know, it's not always, they don't always fit neatly. I think a really good example of a complicated problem is building a bridge for government. You know, you need engineers, you need manuals, you need to follow rules. You know, I don't want the engineer who's building my bridge to be taking an emergent approach to that. I want them to follow the rule book, to follow physics, and to build a bridge that will stay up. And that's a really good example of a complicated thing that governments do. Complex things that governments do are like try to manage, address, reduce homelessness. You know, that is what we call in government a wicked problem. You cannot solve it. It's really, really different to building a bridge. And I guess the argument that we often make is that the tendency in government is to treat all problems as though they are complicated. If only we gather enough data, if only we gather enough evidence, if only we break this down into its component parts, we will solve homelessness. Instead of recognising, well, actually, homelessness is a different kind of challenge. Homelessness is a complex challenge. And so we need an entirely different mindset and set of tools to address or engage with, because you can't solve homelessness. So you need an entirely different toolkit.
I had a question, Thea, and I guess is it okay if I ask it now?
Yeah, of course.
I had a question because homelessness is an interesting example, right? Because you hear like, you know, we get a new government and they're like, we're gonna fix this issue and this issue and this issue and this issue, and it's like, it's not that they don't recognize that they're complex issues and you can't really solve them. You can sort of like nudge them, but it's almost like our community's expectations are for problems to be solved. You know, like, why are we allowing these problems to stay? Why can't we solve poverty? You know, we've got so many rich people. Why can't we solve poverty? Things like that. And it's almost like that tension between what government can, or what even us as people can actually do versus the community's expectations of what we can do. Yeah,
I completely agree with that. And, you know, and part of what I think I'll come to is like, I think that part of the responsibility of government and leaders generally is to actually start shifting the narrative on this stuff. Because until governments start saying things like, we cannot solve this, you know, this is not a solvable problem, and start using different language, you know, then the delusion, if you like, continues, and we continue to have conversations about solving things that can't be solved and fixing things that can't be fixed. Now, it doesn't mean that you throw your hands up and say, all right, well, we just won't engage in homelessness. It's absolutely not that. It's that the way you engage, the way you think about measuring success, all of those things, that looks different. So that's exactly what this second part is focusing on. So complexity matters because it necessarily changes how we work. It changes how we define and measure success, and it changes how we view ourselves. And what I mean by that is that if we go back again to the Cynefin framework, in the blue text, you can see that there are different ways of working. There's you sense, categorize, respond. You sense, analyze, respond if it's complicated. You probe, sense, respond, and you act, sense, respond. And we spoke about some of those already. Sorry, I just can't remember which way to click my mouse. So, you know, how we define and measure success in complexity also looks really different. We need different measurement tools. And because there is not that clear link between cause and effect, you can't measure success or failure in the same way that you do for complicated problems. And lastly, and I'll go into all of these elements in a bit more detail, in complex systems, it's really important to see yourself as a system actor, as an actor in a bigger system, and particularly, again, for government. And I know I focus a lot on government because that's where I work, but to understand that you are not at the centre or the top of the system, you're just part of the system, is a really, really important mindset shift, and requires a really different way of operating. So this is from a paper that a colleague of mine wrote, which is called Exploring the New World, Practical Insights for Funding, Commissioning and Managing in Complexity. And what they offer here is a framework to support particularly governments, but it applies to all organisations who are wanting to embrace complexity. And it sets out a model for a new way of working. When you're working in a complex environment, like say you are engaged in a project that's trying to address or engage, improve rates of homelessness in a city, the first thing that you have to do in a complex environment like that is build relationships and trust. Because in complexity, because the ground is constantly moving and things aren't predictable, the relationships with the people that you're working with are everything. And the more I learn about this and the more I sort of read about it, the more I realise how central relationships are to all of this kind of work. So Toby, through this work, Toby Lowe, who's my colleague, spends a lot of time when he works with governments on building relationships across different players in the ecosystem. So people from different parts of government, as well as with social workers who are working with people experiencing homelessness, as well as people with lived experience of homelessness, and really building a broad and deep coalition of people who have experienced the system from different angles and who have different perspectives to bring. And through that, you work to make the system visible, because what homelessness looks like from the perspective of someone in Treasury, the Treasury Department, looks very different from how it looks for a social worker, for someone who has experienced homelessness. So it's drawing together collectively through these relationships a much richer, deeper map of the system, and establishing a shared purpose, which might be reducing the rate of homelessness, or it might even be a level above that, because that's probably even too reductionist, because then you fixate on that. It might be creating the conditions for people to live their best lives. That's very hard to measure, but we can come back to that probably another time, actually, looking at the time. Then you work together to co-design an approach, which would not be, a $5 million pilot. It would be a bunch of small experiments. And then you test out the experiments, you observe what happens when with that program of work, you learn from it, and then you redesign it. And learning is absolutely critical. So I think that, the two most important parts of working systemically, working effectively in complexity, is building trust and relationships and learning, and then iterating that based on what you learn. Because again, if you think about that picture of the starlings, moving in the sky, the system is dynamic, it's constantly moving. And so you need to keep observing what's happening and responding to that. So I'm actually not going to go through this because in any great detail. I have written a blog on it, which I'm really happy to share afterwards. But I think, again, like Hilary Cottam, who's written a wonderful book called Radical Help, speaks about the role of a shift in the role of government, not as the controller of mechanical levers, but as head gardener, whose role is to tend and nurture, and where necessary, weed the system of which it is a part. So just to give you a really practical example of what this looks like in practice, like what does it actually look like for a government to take these principles and apply them in practice? this is a study that's led by, was co-designed by someone that I know here in Victoria. And it was about translating systems thinking into practice, as you can see, for community action on childhood obesity. And what they did was, it's a part of Victoria which has very high rates of childhood obesity. And they recognised that obesity can't be addressed by health interventions alone. So what they did, I mean, I don't know if they'd read Toby's paper or not, but they facilitated conversations between people who didn't normally work together. So they brought together representatives from food retailers, community members, families who were struggling with childhood obesity, government and business representatives as well. And they worked together to map the system and to have new kinds of conversations about the many, many different drivers that were contributing to this challenge. In addition, rather than designing a single intervention, so rather than getting this group together and saying, okay, what's the one project we can do, they actually have designed a portfolio of literally hundreds of very, very small community-led initiatives to tackle the multifaceted causes of obesity. And they're tracking this really carefully. There are academic studies like this one wrapped around it to track the progress. But what they're doing is, across that portfolio of hundreds of small interventions, they're constantly learning. They're saying, okay, this one didn't work, we have to let this intervention die. This one's going really, really well, maybe we should put some more energy into that. But then after a year of running its course, it might not be doing well again. So then you let that one die and you find the new one that's now working really well. So it's a very dynamic and learning-oriented way of working. So now I want you to take 5 minutes to again do some solo reflection, to think about something that you're working on which is complex. So again, not the bridge, like not the building the bridge, the growing a garden, or the negotiating relationships at work, or running a program that's clearly in a sort of complex domain. And think about, what have you been doing that is sort of a legacy mindset from projects where you're used to applying tools that work well for complicated things. So where have you been, for example, trying to find the root cause? I just need to crunch heaps of data to understand the root cause of this. And now we would reflect and say, well, actually, that's probably not the right approach for a complex challenge. And what have you been doing really well? And really reflects the kinds of approaches that we've been talking about. So 5 minutes to reflect on that, and then we'll just come back as a group and share for 5 or so minutes, and then close. Okay, we might come back now. So we've only got about 10 minutes left. Just to reflect, I was going to do sharing in pairs, but I decided to do introductions instead because we're a small group. And so we'll skip over that and just come to sharing as a group. So when you're thinking about complex things that you're working on, what came up for you?
I'm happy to start if that's okay. I was thinking about sort of like running Design for Impact as a community, as like a complex thing. I guess the complexity probably stems from like helping people learn how to make change and actually like engaging people and keeping them engaged and finding out what it is that they're interested in and sort of like helping them on their learning journey. I would say things that I think we're doing well is like investing in relationships. So actually like treating people as people and sort of like taking the time to get to know people as and you know their life stories as like individuals. And also I think creating the space for people to act and learn. So you know, being open for people to say, you know, I want to try out this thing as part of Design for Impact, or you know, it would be cool if we do this thing, and sort of actually going with that. I think one thing that I need to change, or we need to change, is probably sort of like creating streams of experiments in a way. So it's sort of like childhood obesity, but you know, instead of just like doing courses all the time, it's like trying out different ways of helping people learn and seeing sort of what resonates and what doesn't.
That's fantastic. Thanks. I think that's a really great example and makes me feel happy because it's a really practical takeaway from what we've been talking about. And I couldn't agree more. I think, you know, this is exactly the right kind of environment to be running small experiments and seeing what resonates with people and what doesn't.
Thanks, Thea. This was amazing. I was just smiling the whole presentation.
Thank you. Did other people want to jump in?
Sure, I got one. So my job, I am the one of the designers on a team of designers that is rebuilding the risk infrastructure for our bank. And that is the investing bank, the lending bank, the credit card, and the holding bank in the UK, Canada, and the US. So it's a large portfolio of risk. It's a pretty established bank, and it's been running a Six Sigma program as well as you could run a Six Sigma program since day one. But it keeps running into the problems that Six Sigma has, which is when you build things in a very linear, blocky way, you leave a lot of gaps and a lot of dark corners that you can't find the real problems in. And so I sort of made the mistake of introducing emergent practice and informal systems to senior leadership. And I've introduced a lot of scary things to risk people and had them not flinch, but that was the only time I've seen them really go white. So what I've realized I need to change is to turn a lot of this theory into something a little bit more practical. What's nice about Six Sigma and where it works is there is a practitioner space that is very accessible. And I think this is great as much as once you can digest it, and if you've got an appetite to digest it, it's a really great rabbit hole to dive down. And I've really been enjoying that rabbit hole. But to onboard practitioners has been really difficult. And I'm trying to find that space where I know Snowden always talks about you want chefs, not recipe books. So how do you creep into that space at the right level?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And yeah, as you say, like translating some of these ideas, you know, that into really practical conversations and tools and practices for people is hard. But you know, because a lot of it is about mindset shift as well. It's about how people think. It's about how they understand their role vis-a-vis others. But I'm going to stop talking and hand to, sorry, I can't see your name. Sachin. because you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so something complex that I'm working on is the discovery of the key initiatives for the organization's roadmap. What's going well is extracting known concerns of the market via social media, listening, asking questions to a diverse population of the demographic, getting contextual understanding from experts in the field who've been there for 20, 30 years. What I need to change at this point and pivot more towards is the observation of the purchase processes of consumers, and have a diary study of the usage and life of the people who have the product, and kind of gauge, because I have formed some hypotheses just to see if those do resonate with the actual life situations of people.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Did anyone else want to jump in? David?
Totally can do that if you'd like to, for sure. Yeah, I feel like there's something that a big part of what we do. We have a lot of different individuals who are working for us and who we're working with, especially like the community around how we operate, as we're kind of using everyone else's resources. But so I think what we're doing well is actually not only within our staff, but within our community around us that supports us, is accommodating everyone's kind of skill sets and their strengths, and basically how they operate. And that's just a very complex organism itself, just people. But from that, I think something that I'd love to change, which is a little bit of a contrast, is just there's so much to do for a small business, and allocating time for every element is something I need to structure a little bit better. And I'm working out how to work with my strengths, which is, I feel, something around building relationships and kind of allocating what needs to be the structure of how we need to operate better by building relationships with people, where people can help us in those areas of where we need some help. And at 1:30 last night in the morning, I wrote all these things down on my wall, and that was this is all appropriately timed. So,
yeah, that's fantastic. I think that's exactly right. Like, sometimes we know this stuff intuitively, but it's so hard to carve out time to, to build relationships and to do all this stuff that sort of feels like the nice stuff that you do if you have time. And I guess what this is trying to say is actually, for, in complex environments, this is not the nice stuff that you do if you have time. This is the stuff that you need to do to succeed. I'm just going to close now. I just want to offer one more, because I think the thing that people often ask me for when I talk about this is like, give me practical examples. What does this actually look like in practice? So I thought I'd just offer, to close, one more example, which comes from a book called The Hidden Power of Systems Thinking by Ray Eisen and Ed Straw. It's quite a dense book, but written by real experts in this space. And they offer a number of examples of systems thinking in practice, which is the type of thinking that that I've been describing. It's the type of thinking that you need to apply in complex settings. Dave Snowden doesn't love the term systems thinking. There are all sorts of turf wars. Some people talk about cybernetics. Dave Snowden doesn't like that either. You can go down rabbit holes, but I like the term systems thinking, and I think it works well with complexity. So that's the language that I use. So an example that Eisen and Straw use is an example in Frome, which is in Somerset in the UK, where health practitioners realised that they just weren't able to meet patients' needs in the context of constrained budgets and constrained resources. So what they did was they connected with community groups, peer support networks, and volunteers to create really rich networks of resources for patients to draw on to address their needs, which often extended beyond the immediate health ailments that a doctor could address through drugs or, or sort of adjunct therapies. Eisen and Straw, and I think this is perhaps the most important thing and what I want to end on, they note that the Frome leaders, so the people who were acting as part of the health system and thought this isn't working, what can we do to make this work better? Because health is a complex thing. The Frome leaders, they say, had a special grounding in systems thinking, but just thought that way. Plenty of people do. You don't have to be a fully fledged systemic thinker to work systemically. And I guess it's that I wanted to finish on, because I think that people can end up feeling so overwhelmed by the language and the difficulty of some of these terms. But to me, what this is about doing is recognizing that when you're working in environments which are made complex by virtue of human relationships, by unpredictable environments, that thinking hard about relationships, about people, about networks, and about working in networked ways is really what you need to be doing. And you don't need a PhD in systems thinking to be able to do that. So that's it from me.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Thea. Thanks for taking the time to both prepare such an awesome talk and come join us. It definitely made me think. Like, I haven't been sort of like part of any of these sessions. I've sort of been focused on like facilitating them, but it was awesome for me as a participant, and I think everyone's got smiles on their faces and pretty happy with that. So yeah, thanks so much for making the time. Hopefully we'll keep in touch, and yeah, it was great.
For sure. Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for being a great group of people to walk through this with.
Thanks, Thea. This is awesome.
Thanks, Thea. This is awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Sorry, Kyle, before we head off,
Thank you.
We've been talking about running a storytelling session. Thea, feel free to drop.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. We've been talking about running storytelling sessions, and I guess Dan, I'm ready with the poll. Over to you to explain the two options.
Yeah. One of the things we came up with when we were doing an ideation session about how to grow our diverse membership with the group is a storytelling session. So what we worked out, I have a friend who is a professional storyteller. He's a good old friend of mine. He's a lot of fun and he's very good at what he does. He's starting a business in specifically storytelling for business. So the intention of the storytelling workshop is to give you guys, us, practice and learning in applying storytelling specifically to explain the design process for people who are new to the group or considering joining the group who aren't designers. Just storytelling to get people excited and understanding. So I'm excited about it. And really the thing that we came to is wondering if people wanted to wait until this current course has ended. So after the next 3 weeks, we would do the session on a Tuesday potentially, or if people would like to do these, it would be 2 sessions. So the first one would be Mike would sort of teach the storytelling and we work on the stories. And then the second session would be coming back and presenting and he would offer critiques. The other option is to just do those 2 sessions on another day. We'd have to figure out the day. I just want to know if like doing 2 sessions with the group. Oh boy. Yeah. Wow. Okay. You've got it right here. Nice. Yeah.
Well, David, for us in Australia, that will be the Wednesday. Like, do we want to do it on a different night,
Oh yeah.
day other than the Wednesday, or do we want to, like run it in parallel to the course that we're running, or wait until the course is finished and do it on the same night?
I think we've got a good traction, and I'm sorry, but I'm not sure about the time frame for our systems thinking course. But since we are now discussing, since Thea came, and we are also discussing Cynefin, and I think we should also be expecting another guest speaker, I think next Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken. We've got a good traction on systems thinking. So let's complete systems thinking A to Z, and then we can look at storytelling. How about that?
Yeah, cool. I think everyone voted for after the systems thinking course, so there's no sort of debate. So okay, cool, awesome, sounds
Yeah.
good. Cool. Dan is helping organize that, so thanks so much for your help, Dan. And yeah, so we've got 2 weeks, and then so we've got 3 weeks, and then the presentations, and then the week after that. But we'll make sure you've got the invitations well ahead of time, so you can put it in your calendar. Awesome. What did you think of? Wait, let me just.
That was awesome.